Great. Well, thank you, Alan, for that very generous introduction. I hope I can live up to that, particularly at this time of day, after lunch in a warm room. So we'll try to make it as stimulating as we can. Thank you also for reminding me of how long I've been at work too.
You started young.
Yeah, I did. I started very young, and actually, I mean, I must give credit to Alan here, because he was actually involved in that very first risk and resilience study that we did at Cranfield, which was like 2002, I think, wasn't it? Which was actually funded by the UK Department for Transport. This is quite, for them, I think, quite a sort of innovative step, because we were just becoming aware at that time that supply chains were indeed critical, obviously, to economic activity, but also, too, that they were becoming more vulnerable. A whole number of things had started to happen around about that time, which was leading us, I think, away from an era of relative certainty into this age of turbulence and volatility, what some have called the VUCA environment. I think I can remember the four words: volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous, right? I have to struggle at this time of day. But I think the point of the story being that much of our supply chain thinking, certainly in the latter part of the 20th century, which is really when I think supply chain management was starting to emerge as a sort of major sort of business issue. Just a sort of trivial fact, the first recorded use of the phrase supply chain management was back in the early 80s, actually in a white paper published by a consulting company then called Booz Allen Hamilton. They're still going strong, changed their name a few times. And whilst people have been talking about the need to sort of manage the end-to-end pipeline and to better manage relationships, this was the first time I think that this had been articulated in such a way, and that the phrase, which rapidly gained traction and has now become, I think, the sort of part of our sort of the wallpaper, so to speak, of business life. But the point about those early sort of ideas in supply chain thinking is that it was based and predicated upon this notion of relative stability. Much, I think, of even now, if we pull down a book on operations management, it'll be about optimization. It'll be about how we can sort of utilize formulae to optimize inventory positions and so on. And that's, I guess, based upon the environment as it then was and indeed had been for many decades, a period of relative predictability in a way. That's all changed, as we know, and I think a lot of our supply chain thinking needs to change with it. And that's really where I've been focusing my sort of thinking over this last, I guess 20 years now since we started in this area. I put together a long presentation, so we're going to sort of cut to the chase, as they say. I don't want to go over all ground. We've had a very good conversation this morning, but I'd rather like to focus on some of the implications, I think, for business in terms of how do we build a more resilient capability within the organization. I think it's pretty apparent that we're talking here about networks. We're particularly, I think, talking about complex systems. In a way, it's a pity those consultants at Booz Allen called it a supply chain. Well, first of all, I'd rather they called it a demand chain, personally, because that would sort of, symbolize it should be driven from the marketplace. But secondly, calling it a chain rather than a network. But anyway, that's the phrase that's become universally recognized. But I think this notion of complex systems is something which supply chain thinkers and supply chain managers can actually benefit from seeking to understand a little bit more about complexity. I know very little about it. I've tried to get into it as deeply as I can. I was aided in this by having the pleasure, in a way, of supervising a PhD student at Cranfield I did this jointly with our then Professor of Complex Systems, Peter Allen. Both of us are now retired. But it was really very interesting because this was the first time I'd encountered the use of advanced modeling techniques like intelligent agent modeling to enable us to better understand the interactive effects of networks. And I think this is where a lot of the sort of challenge comes in terms of supply chain risk management today, recognizing that the word complexity, we tend to use it conversationally to mean complicated, and obviously most complex systems are complicated. But as we know, the real meaning of complexity in a systems sense is interconnected, interdependent. And the fact that these agents, which may be the nodes or the links of our network, are not independent of each other. And that the way in which they operate together is not always that predictable. And again, one of the learnings that I took away from this is that we can't actually optimize a complex system. We can seek to improve its performance, but the notion that something that's constantly changing can be optimized, I think, is a sort of a significant mistake. And yet, even still today, we'll find businesses and the consultants who advise them and so forth talking about network optimization models, talking about how we can actually come up with the architecture of a supply chain which is capable of outperforming competitors, and yet doesn't take account of the fact that this is not a static world that we're in. This is something which is very fast moving, and that we need much more of a focus on probabilities and the sort of probabilistic approach rather than the deterministic view that most of these models seem to have. But that's just by way of where I'm coming from, so to speak. And I think that yes, whilst we obviously recognise a significant amount of risk of disruption to any supply chain is potentially going to come from external factors in the environment, my interest is actually in more what we might call systemic risk, which is risk that's actually embedded in the system because we put it there, basically. The decisions that we've taken, be it on outsourcing, be it on moving offshore, be it on going lean, whatever it may be, these are decisions that we've actually taken ourselves. And because we put it there, we have the opportunity, if we wish, to take it out as well. Maybe not completely, but at least to seek to reduce that systemic risk and the impact that it might make. And that, I guess, is the sort of point of view that I'd like to explore. And so that if we were ever to use that word optimize, we shouldn't be talking about optimization in its usual sense of optimizing cost, but actually optimizing resilience. But I'd rather not use the word optimization anyway. I don't know whether we sort of try to define supply chain risk because, of course, it's got so many different connotations in so many different contexts, and most of my focus is around business and business interruption, and recognizing that many of these things, which in the past we thought, well, we can insure against this, but actually very few of these things can be insured against. We can get business interruption insurance, but typically that only extends to property-related risk. You can get contingent business insurance, but that simply relates to what's happening at your key suppliers or your key customers. And a lot of the potential downside of risk is actually on things like reputation. It's on things like loss of market share. We're all familiar with some of these studies that have been carried out which look at the impact on shareholder value, for instance, of supply chain failures. There was that well-known study by Hendricks and Singal on supply chain glitches, which highlighted the significant effect that a supply chain disruption could have on medium to long-term shareholder value. So I think this notion that risk should be looked at in this wider sense from a business perspective, I'm talking here obviously about business risk, this notion that it actually leads to an erosion of consumer confidence, customer confidence, and clearly as a knock-on impact of that, the impact on shareholder value, not just in the short term, but often for significant periods as well. And so the idea of resilience is a way in which we can try to sort of put some shock absorbers in place, so to speak, to be able to absorb the potential negativity of these disruptions, I think is quite appealing. One thing I'd like to just sort of advocate, and I'd be interested in your sort of views on this, is that I think we should look at resilience as really having sort of two drivers, basically, two dimensions. We've talked already about recovery, but I think the other key element of resilience is actually resistance. So this is a little bit like sort of getting inoculated against flu or something, that hopefully this is going to give us the ability to resist this intrusive event. But also, too, recovery, that if we do get it, we need to find a way of which hopefully the effects aren't that long-lasting. So maybe it would be useful if we sort of extend the discussion to look at this notion of resistance as well as resilience, as well as recovery. We're all familiar with the reasons why our supply chains are more vulnerable. I think we could probably write, I'm sure somebody has a thesis on this. To me, I think it's all been based upon the notion that supply chain efficiency, and this is one of the themes of the workshop, the Roundtable, should be the predominant sort of factor driving our sort of supply chain design, our supply chain architecture. And this probably indeed has been the case. And I don't think that's going to change. So one of the things that we might want to reflect on is if we talk about Alan, I don't want to contradict Alan, but Alan talked about the trade-off between resilience and efficiency. But if we think of that as two axes and we draw a sort of an efficient frontier, so to speak, between the two, what maybe we should be talking about is, can we shift that frontier so that it's not about a trade-off, it's actually about saying, can we get both these things? Can we improve efficiency and at the same time improve resilience? And we can if we're able to move that frontier, so to speak. So I'd like to talk about some of the ways we might try to actually make that happen. Again, I think as we're all sort of familiar that I guess in the past, we've tended to focus on that top right-hand box, the things which are going to hurt us the most and which are the most likely to happen. But latterly, I think there's been a sort of growing recognition that, well, hopefully we've taken care of those, or we should be very much focused around them. There's now much more interest, I think, on what we call high-impact, low-probability events, so the top left-hand box, becoming, I think, an area of much more concern, because typically these are things which we don't plan for, where we don't necessarily have the necessary resilience built into our systems. This is a sort of ash cloud type potential impact and events of that nature. And this, I think, might sort of colour the way we sort of think increasingly about what resilience actually means. I'd like to use that as our sort of starting point there. I'm going to move rapidly through this because I was going to talk a little bit about how so much of this risk actually lies upstream of our business. Yes, we're aware very much of the external events that can affect significantly our business, but more particularly the way that risk often is several stages removed from our own particular business, not just at the first tier of supplier, but often at the second and even the third tier. And this idea of contagion in a supply chain where risk can very rapidly spread, I guess best for most of us exemplified by the effects of the global financial crisis 2007-2008. Had somebody even just a year or so before that said, a problem with the sort of mortgage market in North America is going to have a significant impact on businesses around the world, most people would have looked at you fairly, well, I would certainly have looked at you fairly blankly and said, what do you mean? What is the possible connection? Well, we, of course, all know full well, some of us to our cost, what that connection is. So this notion of contagion, spreading across a supply chain that we only vaguely understand. And so one of the points I really wanted to make here is that this notion of, do we really understand the shape of our supply chains? In talking, as I've had the benefit of doing at Cranfield, where we run many executive programs, the benefit of talking to managers, where it's very clear that most companies have got pretty good insight, thankfully, into their tier one supply base. They keep a fairly close eye on their financial strength and any potential vulnerabilities. But ask them a little bit about tier 2 and tier 3, rather less understanding and rather less sort of awareness, I think, of where some of these potential vulnerabilities might be coming from. And yet when we actually explore in detail supply chain disruption, we'll find the majority of these are actually not coming from our sort of near neighbours, they're coming from some distance away. And so this notion, as I say, that we need to start thinking much more about the sort of interactions and the possibility for the unexpected consequences. It's rather like the sort of in chaos theory, the notion of the sort of butterfly flapping its wings and having an effect. I've never quite worked that one out on sort of hurricane somewhere the other side of the world. But the principle behind that, I think, is something which a lot of supply chain managers have not yet fully recognized, because we've moved into the situation gradually. It's a bit like boiling that frog. We haven't sort of recognized that over the years, through these decisions that we've taken, we've actually changed dramatically the risk profile and the possibility for contagion. And that, I think, is where there's thousands of examples like this. We don't need to dwell on particular ones, where companies totally unaware of their upstream second and third tier supply base have been brought to a halt as a result of problems that have happened way back. Dell's operations shut down when Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation, who they didn't think was a supplier of theirs actually at the time. It turned out they were one of its biggest customers, but indirectly. Whilst they didn't send them a check every month, they sent their first tier suppliers checks, all of whom were buying, not all of them, but the vast majority were buying from the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company. Toyota, a company whose name has been synonymous in the past at least, with total quality management, just in time and so on, been struck in the last 5-6 years with recall after recall. And again, when you explore that and try to understand why, mostly it's because of the massive change that they've made as they went global in their supply-based strategy, moving away from a very closely connected kairetsu sort of approach where everybody knew everybody else's business, to one where you're much more dependent upon people who you may not even know, like the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation. So let's focus now on those are the sort of the challenges that I think have come around as a result of this major change in the backdrop to supply chains. Let's spend the remaining time that I've got. How much is the remaining time, actually, Alan? All right, okay, let's do that. Because what I would like us to do is just focus on a couple of ideas. The first point was about supply chain understanding, and particularly trying to explore what we might call the critical paths. Because these supply chains are so complex, there's no way yet. Who knows, blockchain might change all of that, but we still have to get the information in the first place to establish that blockchain anyway. And my view is we should be focusing on what we might call the critical paths. And critical paths generally tend to have a number of characteristics. It could be that they have long lead times, so that replenishment lead times I'm talking about here. You can't move quickly. Maybe there's no short-term alternative source of supply, because if there is, well, that makes it less critical, obviously. Could be that there are bottlenecks. It could be those bottlenecks could be in the form of production bottlenecks. More likely they're bottlenecks in terms of distribution, ports, whatever it might be. But also, too, that they've got high levels of what I call identifiable risk. We skipped over, because we didn't have time to talk about auditing risk under these 5 elements of supply, demand, process control, and environmental risk. But really what it's saying is, if it sort of ticks boxes on any one of those 5 areas, then clearly that's something that we need to explore in more detail. But the principle I'm making here is that we need to start to understand what is it that actually makes a critical path critical, so to speak. And one of these things, I think, which we might benefit from exploring in more detail is what I like to call the shifting center of gravity of our supply chains, because these critical paths keep moving, keep changing. And the way I think of a center of gravity is to say that our supply chains are subject to a number of forces or vectors. Some are on the supply side, some are on the demand side. On the supply side, we've got vectors which are to do with relative labor costs and the rate at which those costs are changing. We've got materials and resource availability and, of course, the costs of those too. We've got skills and their availability, their shortage, their cost, and transport costs themselves, and many other elements on the supply side. And these keep moving and keep changing. So decisions that we took even just a few years ago, we've mentioned already this morning the way in which the search for low-cost country sourcing, for instance, led to a number of decisions which might have changed the risk profile. But what constitutes a low-cost country, that itself changes quickly these days. So on the supply side, we've got these forces which are moving constantly. On the demand side, same thing's happening. We've got changing demographics, obviously, changes in disposable incomes and the relative purchasing power in different parts of the globe, changing consumer preferences, partly linked to changing disposable incomes, industry developments and life cycles, industries growing, industries declining. Point I'm making here is if we make decisions, again, using the sort of principles that we've used in the past of optimization and so on, based upon today's conditions, that network that we design and create is probably not going to work, at least not as well as it might do, in 5, 10, 15 years' time. And yet we often make decisions which are set in concrete. It's difficult to change. You know, we centralize our production, we focus our factories, we build European distribution centers rather than national distribution centers. And these are all decisions which are made for the medium to long term. It's not easy to change these decisions once we're committed. We can't suddenly shut that factory and open a new one. We can't suddenly shut down that distribution center. And this is leading us to think about, is there a different way of doing things? In this VUCA world that we talk about, it may well be that the best decisions are the ones that give me the greatest flexibility. Is it possible to design a supply chain which is adaptable, which is flexible, which can be reconfigured if conditions change? I don't know what tomorrow is going to bring, so do I really therefore want to design a system now which is going to commit me to a world which could look quite different from the world we know today? With a colleague at Oxford, Matthias Hollweg, we sort of coined this notion of structural flexibility. We're not just trying to introduce more jargon into the management lexicon, but really trying to move beyond the sort of idea of flexibility as it's normally used in operations management. Typically being able to move and change quickly, particularly in the light of changes in volume and mix of demand. When we talk about flexible manufacturing systems, that's normally what we're referring to. But here we want to go a little bit beyond this and talk about being able to change the system as a whole. as and when these significant seismic shifts take in that supply-demand pattern of changing centers of gravity. When the center of gravity changes, can we change, basically? And what this implies, and I think this is the significant point I want to make here, is a willingness to invest in solutions that maximize responsiveness rather than cost. And that's a difficult notion to sell, I think, particularly in today's sort of hard-pressed financial climate that so many companies find themselves facing, where the pressure is constantly to go for low-cost solutions, whereas which, you know, we might mistakenly think of as more efficient solutions, but my argument is that actually they're not. And some of the ways we might seek to gain this flexibility, this structural flexibility, and this maybe is a point on which we could sort of open up the conversation. Clearly, it's very much about sharing, I think. We've already used the phrase, I forget who it was this morning, talked about, was it you, Joe, about the sharing economy? The notion that says, well, actually, you know, leasing things and renting things and borrowing things, sharing things, may well be the way of the future. And I think there's a lot of implications here for our supply chains. That this, some have called this the Uberization of supply chain management. Because firstly, obviously, the one thing we have to share if we're to mitigate risk across a complex network is information. This was demonstrated, it's interesting to reflect on this, way back in 1960-61 when, none of you were around then, but Jay Forrester at MIT introduced this idea of industrial dynamics. And this is where, of course, the bullwhip effect was first identified. And what he really highlighted all those years ago was that the way we actually manage bullwhips and the sort of impacts that they have on our supply chains is by sharing information. Out of that, of course, at MIT grew a whole number of insights, Peter Senge's work and so on, but also, too, things that we all use on our courses if we're running supply chain management courses like the beer game and so on. It's all based upon this basic principle that if we can share information, we can mitigate significantly some of these impacts. But the one which I'm particularly interested in is the recognition that maybe if we want real flexibility, maybe I shouldn't be investing in bricks and mortar. Maybe what I want is access to capacity and access to assets. This is the Uberization notion. If I can share, if I can pay for something when I need it, pay per use. We talked about servitization earlier this morning, which again is a coming, I think, tsunami that's going to change dramatically the shape of our supply chains. Also, too, the risk profiles, because one of the things about servitization is it transfers risk in quite a significant sort of way. There's many things we can talk about here, and I'm sure we want to go on to do that. But just to take us towards that sort of point, because I know I'm running out of time here, a view that I've been sort of trying to expand and explore in a little more detail is borrowing this idea from sort of financial planning, this notion about real options, based upon the philosophy that the best decisions, at least I would argue this, the best decisions are those decisions that keep the most options open. So that if you take a decision today, will this lead to least regret, 5-10 years down the road? And so before we take any decision on supply chain architecture or changing that architecture, we should maybe ask the question, in taking this decision, what options am I actually shutting down? Because it may well be that I actually want to increase the number of options that I have. I want to maybe invest in options. Options are things that we can buy and indeed sell if we wish to. The option to expand or contract, the option to abandon, the option to switch. Inventory, is an option, basically. Many of these ideas run counter to the sort of lean thinking that we've been used to for so many years. But to me, the real advantage of this, and this is the notion borrowed from financial planning, first of all, it's probabilistic. It's not sort of deterministic. But more particularly, it recognizes that risk is a distribution, as we know. We tend to use the word risk, and indeed in Igor's first presentation, the Oxford Dictionary definition that you used was about basically the downside of risk. Whereas if we look at risk as a distribution, what it's saying is that there's an upside as well. And those companies, I think, that are prepared to invest in these sorts of options are those who are going to be best placed to take advantage of that upside. Because what this effectively means is that if we're prepared, if we've actually built structures which enable us to change quickly when conditions change, we're in that position to take advantage of that and hopefully to benefit as a result. I'm not going to say any more about this because I know I've run over time and we do have to have a discussion about this. But I'd just like us to sort of finish on this notion that says, well, how do you turn what could be a threat into an opportunity? And that really, to me, is what resilience actually really should be about. It's enabling us to make that sort of change in the way we think and the way we act. So there we go.